So whilst a chunk of the population struggles to make ends meet as not only does their job disappear, but perhaps their entire industry sector is on its knees. Meanwhile, city folks are pushing up share prices as though these were the best of times. And others whose jobs have carried on regardless are putting more money into property, with in some places house prices going through the roof. In other places, housing roofs are going through the roofs as people put in an extra level on their house as part of a second-story extension during the lockdown. So asset prices are going crazy. Is that a problem? If so, just how bad is it? And how do we keep it under control? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So there's a theory, isn't there, Steve, that rising asset prices, particularly shares, are good for GDP because when you sell those stocks, you'll have money that can be used to buy stuff, and that is going to help the economy along there. That is certainly the line being used now by central banks, who are helping that, of course, with very low interest rates or negative interest rates. So there's no point in buying government bonds. Buy shares. What could possibly go wrong? Well, of course, what could possibly go wrong is that it has a big impact on on income diversity. If you've got rising share prices that only a certain section of society can take part in, and similarly with house prices, you really do get a very widening rich-poor gap, don't you?
And that's what's happened. I mean, because it's not the poor who own shares. So you'll get this argument every now and then that workers have have interest in the share market because of their 401k schemes in America or their superannuation schemes in Australia and so on, pensions in the UK. But they actually make up a minuscule proportion of the overall market. That fundamentally it's the wealthy who own shares. And what you got here is an attempt to stimulate the consumption side of the economy of making the wealthy feel wealthier, when the fact is that they are relatively, even with their vast wealth, because they don't need to spend as fast as the rest of us and spend on much more esoteric items than we do, they don't consume a large amount. The bulk of consumption still comes from workers, and they're not the ones who are benefiting from the increase in share prices.
And yet central banks aren't concerned about this, are they? I mean, they I think they're aware, and that argument I gave that, well, it has a spin-off benefit that it trickles down. I'm trying not to laugh. They use that as an excuse for saying, well, okay, that is a side effect of low interest rates, but we can live with that. And yet, even before we got here, shares were just continuing to go up. If we look at the earnings per share for the S&P 500, in 1980 it peaked at 50. In fact, sometime around there it was as low as 40. Now it's at 100. In December last year, just before the COVID-19, it got over 140. So, and this is in real terms. So if you had, say, $30,000 at today's prices invested in the S&P 500 in 1980, at the end of last year, that in real terms would have risen to 140,000. So the share market doesn't feel like a gamble, does it? It is just a license for passive income for anybody who's got any money, or anybody, more to the point, anyone who can borrow money.
Yeah, and actually what we're seeing as a result of this is also an increase in the level of margin debt, because people are borrowing to lever up the gains they're getting, which are, for those who can actually afford to participate in the market, being underwritten by quantitative easing, which began, of course, with after the global financial crisis, and has been reinvigorated by the COVID crisis. But each time they're doing it, it's simply pushing up an index which was already, when you look at when quantitative easing began, it was already at the long-term average. So there was no need. If you take the very long view using Robert Shiller's cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio, the average is about 15, and that average, of course, includes the hyper overvalued period of the last 30 years. But when QE was started by Bernanke during the financial crisis, the index was at 15. Now that's the long-term average. Why do you need to push something up when it's already at the average? But that's exactly what the central banks have done.
So why have they done it? I mean, it's an obvious question. Why? I mean, they must know that it's adding to the income gap.
Yeah, I mean, well, interestingly enough, there was one of the many useful papers coming out of the Federal Reserve, and I'm trying to spot it as we talk, but I haven't actually managed to locate it yet. Worked out that the rationale that the Bernanke gave, just to backtrack, the rationale Bernanke gave for QE was to make people feel wealthier and therefore encourage spending out of wealth as well as out of income. And when that comment was made, there'd already been a Federal Reserve study saying, well, there is no wealth effect for shares. There's a tiny one for housing, but almost none for shares. And yet, of course, QE was directed strictly at the stock market. When it began, the stock market was this S&P was the wonderful set of points of 666. It's since risen up to the thousands, the 3000s level. And yet, it was known that there was really not going to be much effect out of this. So I think it comes down to the fact that it's the only mechanism they have. And when you have just one mechanism, a bit like the old story, when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The only way that the Federal Reserve can interact right now with the economy is through the financial institutions. The way they do is by buying and selling bonds off them. This seems to have said, well, let's just do more of the buying bonds and see what happens. And that's about as rich as I think. That's about as intelligent as I can make the policies appear.
Well, Eric Rosengren from the Boston Fed admitted to the AFT earlier this year that they just don't have the tools to stop firms and households from taking on excessive leverage. So there's an admission of defeat. You talked about the wealth effect from housing. So how does that happen? Because if I buy a multi-million-dollar property, well, maybe at some point I sell it, and so I've got cash which I spend in the economy. So my wealth is generated as spilled back into the economy. But by and large, I mean that's money that's sitting in the house, unless it gives me greater equity, so I can borrow and spend more against the house. Is that where the wealth is being created?
Well, I mean the wealth is created by the valuation you put on the house before you sell it. But actually, what's going on behind the wealth effect is probably yet again the credit effect, because the association of high levels of household wealth with high levels of spending is a bit like the classic South Park episode where the garden gnomes go around stealing underpants, and there's the 3-point plan. Point 1, steal underpants. Point 2, question mark. Point 3, profit. And again, this is just what seems to happen all the time when you have a set of, only this one mechanism of buying bonds off the private sector. You go and hope it's going to have the effect you want because it's the only thing you can do.
And yet, what do they do to counter it? That's where they, because there are Fed officials that are concerned about asset bubbles, and they want to introduce stronger regulatory measures. So that presumably, I don't know, higher capital requirements, but I wonder if that's going to make much difference. I mean, lending overall is down. It's just who they're lending to that's the issue. It's non-productive lending that's that's going on. It's the productive lending that seems to be slowing down. I mean, what can they do through they sort of like created this mess, and then they say, well, we'll introduce regulatory measures to try and counter what we've done.
Yeah, and it's another classic Ronald Cobb cartoon. Pardon me, senor, does your left hand know what your right hand is doing? And this again is the situation the central banks find themselves in. If you only have one mechanism, it's the only mechanism you can use. Therefore, you find a reason in your own mind to explain why it's going to work, and you go and do it again and do it again. And now you're caught where the basic support of the stock market is the Federal Reserve.
And they can't get out of it now, of course. They've created the monster because people are borrowing to buy shares or houses. So they've borrowed so much that if banks were to raise interest rates, then the greater the risk of default, so they're not going to do it. So how long are we going to be left in this situation where we continue to see share prices rise? And of course, people keep on investing in the share market because they're thinking, interest rates are going to be next to zero or below it for the foreseeable future, possibly for the rest of our lifetimes, because no one can see a way out. And the more that happens, the more they borrow, the greater the likelihood of that's actually what happens in the long term. There's no way of turning this vessel around, is there?
No, I don't think there is. And you look at stock market valuations, which they're not the highest they've ever been. We're higher now than the peak in 1929, before Black Tuesday, when the Case-Shiller Index was 30. We're now at 32.32, but the highest was virtually pretty close to 45 in 2000 during the dot-com bubble and the internet bubble. So we haven't quite reached those levels of valuation, but we're very close to it. And yet, of course, the economy is in no way similar to the the bubble economy of the 90s and up to 2000. There was a genuine boom going on there and a genuine level of innovation and investment, with the laying out of optical cable and all the internet companies coming in and so on. There's nothing like it now, but we've got a stock market valuation that is within cooee of those levels.
Well, I think in the United States it's higher. In fact, look, if you want to hear the full version of this podcast, then you need to become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the options there, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, become a supporter, and you get access to this and 200 or more podcasts that we've recorded over recent years, me and Steve. That's it for this week, though. Thanks for listening. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. See you next week.